Hi everyone, Ben here from musictheoryacademy.com. In this lesson, we're going to have a look at the chromatic scale. We're going to ask the question, what is a chromatic scale? We're going to have a look at how you notate the chromatic scale. And finally, we're going to have a look at composing with chromatic scales and have a look at a few examples. So firstly, what is a chromatic scale? Well, the word chromatic refers to notes that are a semitone or a half step apart. Let me show you this when we look at a keyboard. So if we take two notes, C and the black note just above it, which is a C sharp or a D flat, depending on which key you're playing in, then these two notes are a semitone or a half step apart. Similarly, F sharp or G flat to G is also a semitone or a half step apart. Now sometimes you can have two white notes that are also a semitone apart. B and C would be an example of this. If we start on B at C and come down to B, that is a semitone or a half step apart. That's because there are no notes in between the C and the B. Some white notes, however, if we go from D to E, this is not a semitone, this is a tone, because there is another black note in between it. The semitone would be D to D sharp or E flat. So chromatic refers to notes that are a semitone or a half step apart. So what about the chromatic scale? Well, a chromatic scale is when you put more of these notes together, and all of the notes in the scale are a semitone or half step apart. So here we have a chromatic scale beginning on C, and if I go up all of the notes, that is a chromatic scale. It's a chromatic scale that starts on C, and because I've gone up, it's ascending. I can come back down. That would be described as a descending chromatic scale. Now, you can start and finish a chromatic scale on any note. Here's an example. Like this time I'm going to start on F. That's the ascending, and here's the descending. It's another chromatic scale. It doesn't matter which note you start or finish on. Also, chromatic scales can be shorter. They don't have to go the whole way up. So if I started on C and ended on G, and you saw that in a piece of music, you could describe that as a chromatic scale. So how do we notate a chromatic scale? Well, let's look at the example I just gave you. You can see a couple of things straight away. Firstly, the ascending chromatic scale tends to use sharps, and when you're descending, you tend to write flats. However, there are a few other things to think about when notating a chromatic scale. Firstly, every line and space must have at least one note. Secondly, however, there should be no more than two notes for every line and space. And the final thing to think about is the use and sharps and flats should be appropriate to the key signature. So if you're writing in a key signature that has lots of flats, you may tend to write quite a lot of flats. Equally, if you're writing in a key with lots of sharps, you may find that you notate more sharps in your chromatic scale. So it's just having a sense of what's appropriate to the key signature. So what about composing using the chromatic scale? Well, chromatic scales are a wonderful way of creating sadness or tension in the music. Here's a couple of examples. Firstly, very, very famous example of the use of chromatic scales was by Rimsky-Korsakov in his Flight of the Bumble Bee. In this opening section, you can just hear the way he works his way down the chromatic scale. And so on. And when he gets to bar 9, he very cleverly uses these little chromatic scales to give a sense of the bumblebee in flight. Another example of the use of chromatic scales is in Beethoven's Sonata in D minor. You can hear how he just uses little snippets of the chromatic scale in the first few bars and before getting to bar 9, where he just launches into this long descending chromatic scale. So we've had a look at the chromatic scale. We've asked the question, what is it? We've looked at how you notate the chromatic scale, and we've talked about composing with chromatic scales with a few examples. I really hope you found that helpful.